Hi everyone, welcome back to the studio. Today we are going to do our smallest nesting mug. I am so excited for this because I have espresso dreams. I think that this little petite nesting mug is just going to make the cutest addition to anyone's coffee bar. And the smaller the nesting mug, the more you can stack, which is just adorable. Anyone who markets minis markets to me. I'm telling you what, that's like where my heart is. So we are going to put our large, our regular, and our medium, which you've already, I've done videos on. I have not done one on the regular yet, so that one's still to come. But the large and the medium, those videos are out there for you. Here I have the template that I have measured out for you, 11 by 3.25. We are hoping to have these templates up for you on the website. We are trying to figure out some template issues, but we are working really hard to get those up for free for you. So I have been toying with rolling out my slab, putting in texture on both sides. I have videos on how to do that. This slab is very wet. And I've been working, I'm trying to push my slabs to see how far I can get away with it. So I have been really working with wetter and wetter slabs, and it's been working out pretty good here. So I'm trying to get to the point where maybe I could just roll it out and work with it right away, but that might just be wishful thinking. So I've got our cutter here that we've specially made for you for this petite nesting mug. Remember, when you get the cutter, it will be bigger than the bottom. And the reason we do that is to account for the clay that we wrap around. So it should be about 1/4 inch all the way around. That's how you know you're using the correct cutter. I suggest writing the name right on here. Or I had a gal say that she stores them right on top of each other, which makes good sense to me. So let's go ahead and cut out our slab here. I am going to decide which part of my texture I want on the inside and which part I want on the outside. And I think I'm going to put this lacy bit on the inside and have the bigger texture on the outside. So I'm going to find a part of the pattern that I really like. And then I'm going to make my cuts here. So the side cuts need to be beveled. Okay, let me bring you a little bit closer here. Work this out. Okay. Side cuts need to be at the same angle. So I'll hold my cutting instrument at the same angle when I'm doing these two side cuts, and then the tops and the bottoms can just be straight. Now I like to measure my templates a little big, and that gives me extra clay to wrap around. The reason I do that is because depending on how wet your slab is, how humid your conditions are, I like to always have more than enough than not enough. So I always err on that side of caution. And actually, I can just use my template top. I cut my templates out of craft foam, and I have been using a rotary cutter, a pinking cutter, to give me that zigzag. And I've been really loving that because it gives me, those points are really easy to follow and it's really forgiving. So if I kind of put my knife into the template a little bit, I'm not taking out chunks of it. So there we go. We've got our little petite nesting mug all cut out. I'm not even going to score these yet because I know that I'm going to be adjusting those sides. So the first step when you're preparing your slab here is to grab your cornstarch. And what we're going to want to do is determine if you have a pattern that has a specific up and a specific down. We want to make sure that we're keeping track of that. With our nesting mugs, we build these upside down. So the top will be facing the table and the bottom will be facing up. This is important to me because I want the flowers to be at the bottom and this lacy bit kind of grape-like pattern to be at the top. So I am going to keep track of that. See this here? So this is how I want to build my slab. If your pattern goes every which way, then you don't even have to worry about that step. All right, I've got some cornstarch here, and I am going to just pounce this onto my clay generously. The more wet my clay is, the more cornstarch you'll see me using. And honestly, I think the cornstarch actually absorbs some of the moisture as we go, and it's lending me to work with a wetter slab. That's my theory. If there's any cornstarch scientists out there, please let me know if I'm onto something, okay? All right, so my workflow is always the same. Get rid of any kind of extra cornstarch. If it gets on your clay, it's no big deal. I'm going to push that forward. and I'm going to have my jig facing myself. Now, the reason why I love these nesting mug projects is because they are just so quick to do. So I can see here, I have quite a bit of overlap. Before I start making any cuts, I want to make sure that my jig is making contact 100% with the clay, especially at these bottom points. The top is usually not the issue, it's the bottom. So you want to make sure that as you're dry fitting, you're really bringing your fingers all along that bottom, and that will ensure that we will have a nice contact there. We want it nice and snug. So I am going to go ahead and mark about where I want to make my cut. I always say you can remove this from the jig and put this on the table. You may measure if you want. I always just eyeball. And I don't mind wasting, this will get reclaimed, and you can reclaim with your cornstarch here. If it really is bothering you, you can wipe that off before you reclaim it. But the reason I do that is because then I know mug by mug, I'm able to get the right size. So to be honest, I probably took a little bit. You can see where I dipped in there, and that's not a big deal. I don't fuss about that. I just let the warmth of my hands, see how it brings that in and closes that nicely there. That does not bum me out. Because my clay is so wet, I can easily maneuver that to a point where I'm comfortable with, and that is plenty sealed now. So when we are doing our nesting mugs, you have this ridge here, this ridge line. We are going to score up into that point. Do not seal all the way to the top, because we're going to be molding this top part in, and we're going to be cutting off a lot of extra clay up here. So we only want to tack down up until that point. So let me grab my scoring rib. It doesn't matter. You can score all the way up. You just don't want to add vinegar and attach that, or whatever your slip is that you're using. So I do use a vinegar slip in my studio. It is a combination of white distilled vinegar and a little bit of my standard clay body. I use a black clay and a speckled clay. The black clay lives in my little slippy pot. So if you see a little bit of red, that's where that's coming from. Okay, and then with dry hands, every time I come in contact with that slip, I am bringing my hands down to my apron or to a towel, and I am making sure that I am wiping that off. Water or any kind of moisture will be the enemy of your texture, and that's a really good way to leave fingerprints and lift your texture. So here's the view we're looking at. Okay, I like to look at the bottom, make sure. Now you can see my inner, that lace texture in there. That's okay. That won't completely touch the jig. What we want is just a general snug fit down there. Okay, so I'm going to pull over my banding wheel here, and we're going to start to sculpt and shape this. Would you believe me if I told you that we're already almost done with this project? Like halfway done with it. So I'm going to put it on my banding wheel. I've got my banding bat attached, okay? And this fits a 6-inch insert. And then I am going to start, I like to start warming the clay up a little bit with my hands, and then I will eventually bring in a paddle here. And because my clay is still very, very wet, I'm able to manipulate this. And we're going to pick one side of the clay to be our kind of our reference point here. I'm going to follow the same angle, and then I'm going to start cutting that so we're able to keep our seam nice straight up and down. Okay, so now that I've got that scooped in, I'm going to take my paddle, and I'm going to start just working that clay in from the back and bringing it towards the seam. And then I will show you how we use our jig smartly to just make that top nice and even. So I like to start at the back and kind of work my way towards the seam. You may do this any way you want. In the beginning, I started off, I would just use the warmth from my hands, and that works just fine too. Now I can see here my seam, it's starting to creep in a little too far that way. So I'm going to start taking just little tiny slivers following my same angle. And all I'm doing here is really working to preserve that seam up and down. Okay. And when we do this, I'm going to do it to the other side too. Remember, we're just taking tiny bits off. This is not the time to make a really big decision. Oops. It is way easier to do this little by little than it is to try to add length on. See, so just tiny nips, tiny nips, tiny cuts. And then as we're bringing our hands in, and the reason you'll see I love to leave this extra bit of clay at the top is as we squeeze it in, this seam here, the inner seam starts getting lower and lower. Can you see that? Can you see how close that is already to the jig? If you start off with too short a slab, you will end up going way beneath the jig, and we don't want that. Okay. So, I'm going to keep working that over. I'm going to keep making sure I'm keeping my seams aligned here, and then I will keep removing the extra clay. You're displacing clay here because we're smushing it. So always remember that. The clay has to go somewhere, and in my case, it's not going to go down because it's hitting the table. It's going to go sideways into this seam, and it's going to go up. Now I can see, just I had a little clay kind of splooging out there. I always put my handle over the seam, so I'm not worried about that. And then if you start to get a little bulbous at the seam, take your paddle and just kind of keep that in check. Okay, this is looking really good. I'm almost ready to close down that seam. And then once we get rid of this extra clay here, you'll be able to take care of that seam and make that nice and even there too. Okay, so I'm going to slip and score. That feels good to me. I can see my jig making contact all the way around. Don't be surprised when you cut off. You'll see a little bit of gap at the top, but we're just going to hug that right in, okay? So I've got my scoring rib here. I'm going to get in both spots. I'm going to take my slip, and we are going to seal that up. Now, be really careful. I like to add the slip to the outer clay, the clay that's not right up against the jig. If your slip gets in between the clay and the jig, it could get a little sticky and be a little tricky for you to remove. So just remember that. All right, so I'm going to come in here. I'm going to seal up my seam. And you can see this beautiful curve all the way around. That's going to give us our nesting function. So I'm going to go ahead and make sure my hands are nice and dry so I'm not disrupting my texture. And now let's cut off this extra clay here. And then we will come and we will shape this top to make sure that our little indent there is nice and flat. So I like to pick a spot to start. I usually pick the seam and I scoop out a little U supporting the clay. Okay, see that little U that I was able to scoop out there? That gives me a nice notch, and I'm able to get my knife in there nice and flat. Now I'm going to spin my banding wheel, and as I'm spinning, I'm keeping my knife at the same angle, and I'm using the jig as a guide, so I'm able to come in here and just get really nice and even. Okay, now I'm nice and even all the way around. If you're a little bit beneath the jig, that's really not a big issue because our foot's going to go right on there. And then now we have this nice even attachment. I'm going to take care of my seam. And then this is the point here where if you do want to, you can really make sure that you've got a nice angle there and nice evenness all the way around. All the while we're bringing our hands in and we're making sure that any clay that we're displacing, we're coming back through and making it nice and clean. Okay, how sweet is that? Now you can see we have our little petite mug going on. So I've got my seam at the bottom is correct. I'm going to flip this over. There will be not as much to take off on the top, but I always, just for good measure, run my knife. You can see there is a little bit. We want to make sure that this is nice and even because this is going to be our drinking lid. Identify where your seam is and go ahead and treat that seam. And then I want you to see how even this is all the way around. It's really a beautiful thing. And then if there is any clay that's creeping over the sides, you'll want to release that because as we're taking our jig out, that's going to be harder if you've got clay that's kind of grabbing on like that. So let's go ahead and take this jig out, which is my favorite part. You're going to give this sweetie just a little bit of a twist, and with enough cornstarch, this was a pretty wet slab, we are able to go ahead and get that out of there. Okay, let me see if I can get you overhead here, nice and easy, so you can see how beautiful that is on the inside. Clay is still a little wet, so I don't want to disrupt the round here, but I do want to go ahead and support from the outside and start taking care of this inner seam. Okay, always go with the flow. So if your clay is flowing this way, you're going to bring from the top clay over to your bottom clay. And since I'm so heavily textured on the inside here, I will lose a little bit of texture along that seam, but it's not a big deal. Everything else is just really beautiful in there. And then I take my little vinegar brush with just whatever residual vinegar is on there, and I go ahead and I make sure that seam is nice and closed. We don't want to have any failures at that seam. Anytime I'm doing any kind of adjustments, I stick my rim cone in, and you can see there's no gapping, so I'm still nice and round there. While I've got my rim cone in here, we're going to flip it again and attach our bottom. So I'm going to move the big banding wheel over, and I'm going to use my rim cone as a small banding wheel. Give this a baker's flip. Now I've got 360-degree axis to the bottom, and my rim has tension on it, so I'm not going to lose the round there, okay? I'm going to come around. I already addressed that inner seam. If you didn't do the bottom part, make sure you do it now. I'm going to go ahead and score nice and deeply, and I will also score on the bottom here. This is kind of just a habit because my clay is pretty wet still. I could probably get away with just attaching this, but I don't know. I don't mind the extra measure just to make sure we have a good attachment. Now I decided that I wanted the lacy pattern from the inside to be on the outside, just to bring those designs together, and then we've got the opposite design facing in. So I do a dry fit. Because I use the cutter that came with this set, I am bang on here, and then I am going to attach, I'm going to apply my slip to the attachment, to the part that I'm going to attach, okay? I like to minimize how much liquid is going into my vessel, so this is a good way, and I can see a little bit better so we're not dripping all down the sides. Okay, so I've got my vinegar on there. I'm gonna go ahead and plop this guy back on. Okay, before I put any pressure in, I'm just gonna give it a little spin. That looks good enough for me. Now I'm going to take nice dry hands, and I'm going to start tacking this down, a preliminary tack down, because I'm going to fake my foot in a second here. Now I can see I'm a little wider there, right around where the seam is. That's okay. My mini shark fin will come in, and I will take care of that. If you wanted to make a more decorative bottom, you could do a flatter, a thinner, wider, and then you could roll your clay over. That's very pretty too. So let me grab my small anvil here, and I'm going to pop this bottom in. I'm going to fake this foot here. There we go. And it just gives it a little extra something. Now, as I pop in and fake my foot, I'm going to go back around and recommit, because now I've added a little extra pressure to the center, which lifted up the sides. So that looks really good to me. I'm going to bring my banding back over, and let's do our footwork here. I like to take just a little bit of water. I have a little bit of the same clay body left over from when I was throwing on the wheel, and this creates a slip here for me. There we go. And then I'm going to bring my mug back on here, and I'm going to try to center it as good as I can. I'm going to swirl it around a little bit. I can already feel it's grabbing. Make sure your hand is nice and dry. All right, because I have tension on my rim, I'm not losing any shape there. And let's grab our mini shark fin, which you guys know, if you've been with me for any period of time, you know this is my favorite. Okay, so now we're going to take the mini shark fin. Let me bring you in a little bit closer here. Remember, I'm my cameraman too. Thanks for sticking with me. Let's see if we can get a good angle here. All right, beautiful. So here's a mini shark fin. I start off wide, and then I rock it in to this shape. So I start here, and I'm just gonna start going around, and this serves a couple purposes, very important purposes. It's going to lift up that little slippy band. It's also going to remove some weight from the bottom. Okay, so a lot of clay there. I'm pulling up a lot of clay. So this would be, I would consider this my trimming step. This is an important finishing step. Apart from how it looks, it really does, it just seals up that joint, and it gets rid of any extra slip there. You don't want to have just wet slip hanging out in between the crack between the top and the bottom. That's just going to cause you some heartache. I then flip it over to use the spine size, especially with these tiny ones, the medium and the petite. You can get in here really nicely that way. Now I will fuss, I'll do a few more revolutions on my own. I like to set up for a carved bottom. I like to carve my foot. I'll give you an example of what that looks like. Here we go. I like to do some fluting at the bottom. So I always set myself up with a really steep angle. But I like to show, just pull that loose. If you just stopped here and sponged when you were done, you would have a very, very beautiful bottom. There you go. So you just want to make sure, I'm going to just stick this back on there. But I will come through and I will do just a little extra work for myself there. Making sure, now this mug is meant to stack inside of another one. So you don't want to leave a big bulky situation. But as long as you've got that angle put in there, you should be just fine. Let's bring it back just a little bit more. All right, let's do this top. And then we are done with our first one. And then all we have to do is build another one. I like to make these in sets of 2s, 4s. I think that if you are using them for the nesting function, it's really nice to showcase that. And then I like to build 2 at a time because then it's kind of like a dye lot if you're a knitter, or if you work with any kind of fabric. You know, if you get it from the same dye lot, you're in good shape. Now, since I'm so heavily textured towards the top here, I know that might be a little more prone to cracking. So I'm just going to do just a little preventative work here and just take my finger and smooth that out so that we don't have a lot of that texture running into our lip. My rim cone gives me a really beautiful baseline for that. So if I can give you guys a little more light there. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to twist my rim cone. You'll feel it release and then lift straight up. And here we have our sweet nesting mug number 1. And then I will come through. I do a lot more finishing work at leather hard because I don't want to risk knocking this little sweet mug out around, especially because it has to stack inside of another one. But because our texture is so heavy at the rim, I'm really going to just take some time here and do the same thing on the inside. Just going to kind of close up. I can see where that texture is kind of gapping. I'm going to do that and make sure that my drinking rim is nice and comfortable. And that is our first one. I'm going to come back and do our second one. I will post that one on Instagram. So you'll have one kind of example on each. So a long form and then a little bit more of a short form. Okay, and there she is. This is our petite nesting mug. I'm using the regular rim cone for that one. I'll leave that in there for a while to make sure it's nice and secure. And our mini shark fin. So it's really not a lot of tooling. It's a very quick and easy job. Doesn't take a lot of clay. So I hope you guys give this project a shot. And I can't wait to see what you make and hear what you think of our petite nesting mug jig. Thanks for stopping by.